Okay, why don't we get started? It is 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time here in the Boston area, and I'm delighted to see so many of you around the screen, so many of my colleagues, and so many of you scattered around the world. And just by way of quick introduction, my name is Bhaskar Chakravarti. I'm the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School. And I'm joined here by several colleagues who will engage in a conversation that we know is uppermost in our minds as we consider the impact of the pandemic that is now across the world and has deeply affected all of our lives. The topic of today's conversation is a very broad question, a question about a pandemic-proof world. Now, we know we are not in a pandemic-proof world. The question is, how can we get there? And what's the role of multilateralism? And can multilateralism get us there, even though that will take quite a bit of time? Or are we looking at an impossible feat and perhaps need to look for other solutions? Just by way of quick background on this particular event, this is an event that we host every semester at Fletcher. It is now, this is the 16th airing of the Fletcher Reads the Newspaper event. And the background on this event is we recognize that Fletcher is perhaps the ultimate place to have a global, multidisciplinary conversation about some of the most complex issues that hang around on the front pages of newspapers above the fold. And they hang around above the fold and the front pages for a reason. And the reason is that the underlying drivers behind the issues that are reflected in the headlines are complex. And they're complex because there are multiple factors that are interwoven. There are political factors, there are technological factors, there are business factors, there are economic issues. And what we try and do is take what I would say a uniquely Fletcher lens to understanding the news, which is we engage with our disciplinary experts who are our professors. They help us disentangle the story on the headlines by looking at the question through their disciplinary expertise and help us understand what's going on. Why is this such a challenging issue? It doesn't have to be a bad thing that's on the headlines, it could be an opportunity. And as we listen to people from across the different disciplinary points in the spectrum, we begin to get a sense of the underlying drivers behind the headlines. And then we turn the discussion over to the rest of the room, the participants who are our students, who are the true interdisciplinary experts of Fletcher, who take the classes from our various experts, the intradisciplinary experts, and they help us come up with recommendations and solutions and ideas. So that is the underlying motivator for the Fletcher Reads the Newspaper. So this topic, of course, is perhaps the most emblematic of an interdisciplinary and a global conversation. So welcome to all of you who we hope to see at the Fletcher School at some point in the very near future. We are delighted that you have an interest in Fletcher, and we look forward to welcoming you. We look forward to seeing your applications, and we look forward to our ongoing communications with you. By way of quick introduction to my colleagues who will be joining us in taking apart the headlines, I have just right in front of me, and I'm sure right in front of your screens as well, my dear colleague Ian Johnstone, who's professor of international law. And Ian is an expert on a number of different issues, on a number of different issues, but in this particular conversation, he will help us understand issues relating to international law and national and domestic legal systems, and how international organizations might be able to tackle the challenges that we've got before us. I've also got Deborah Kuchivar, Debbie Kuchivar. She's the former dean of the Cummings School of Veterinary Science. She's also a senior fellow at the Fletcher School. And we are talking about a disease that is a zoonotic disease, originated in animals and jumped from animals to humans. So we'll turn to Debbie for that scientific foundation for where this pandemic started and what might we expect as we track its course around the world. I also have Josephine Wolf, who's our professor of cybersecurity policy and technology policy. We are all now in a socially distant mode, regardless of where we are. Our regular ways of doing business have been transplanted by a digitally mediated way of doing business. And Josephine will help us unpack what are some of the challenges of moving to this socially distant mode, and what are some of the multilateral implications of this global digital transformation that we have gone through over the course of literally 1 week. I have my dear colleague Joel Trackman, who is a professor of international law, and Joel is an expert on the legal implications of business transactions and an expert on international trade. And he'll help us understand what are the implications for global trade and global trade flows as we consider our journey over the next several months and consider some of the solutions that might be up ahead. I'm also joined by my dear colleague, Professor Dan Dresner, who is a professor of international politics and a columnist for the Washington Post. He will help us unpack some of the political implications of what's going on around us. And finally, our colleague, Ken Pucker, who is a professor in our degree, which is delivered entirely online, the Global Business Administration degree, and he's a former COO of Timberland. And this is a role that he has held for a long time, long enough that he has actually led Timberland through multiple crises, similar to what we are living through. In particular, he has led Timberland through the SARS crisis. So we have a fantastic group assembled around here. In addition to the group that's assembled around here, I also have a message from one of our wonderful alumni, Natalie Lahoud, who was an MIB graduate in the year 2017. She's right now fighting the pandemic. She's on the pandemic's response team in the Department of Health and Human Services in the US government. And she is right now on the front line. So she sent us a video message, which we'll have an opportunity to share in a moment. So as I look at the newspapers today and what is right in front of us, I see the ongoing onslaught of this disease. And the most recent news that I'm sure many of you have already seen is that British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has just tested positive for COVID-19. So here we go. Why don't we turn this over to my faculty colleagues, and with the question that is the leading question for this discussion: can we hope to contain this pandemic without a multilateral response? That's the question that I'd like to use to kick off this discussion. But before we get to a specific answer to that question from our different experts, I'd like to ask Debbie Kuchivar to ground us in the origins so that we can better understand the spread of this pandemic. Debbie, could you help us unpack how this started and how this has continued to spread in country after country?
Certainly. As I do that, I'd like to just very briefly share a slide with you. And before I do, I'll mention that many of you have seen Tony Fauci repeatedly on television. He is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease at the NIH in the US. And he's been the leader of that institute for nearly 40 years. So in 1984, when he first began to lobby Congress for funds for research in infectious disease, the map that he used was the small map that is up in the upper right-hand corner. You might guess that that single dot shows the most important emerging disease at that time, which was HIV/AIDS. I want you to now look at this larger map, which is a map that shows emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases that he uses now when he goes to Congress. So I think simply by the sheer number of names that are on that map, you can see that this is a tremendously important global problem. It is not a country by country problem, it's a global problem. And so my particular area of interest and perhaps expertise is what we call One Health. And that's the idea that there is no dividing line between human and animal medicine, and really will add environmental health as well. When you think of the world in that way, humans, animals, and the environment, you can see why we've had so many different emerging diseases become problematic. And that's partially because we now much more frequently disturb the interface between humans and animals. And so that gets us directly to the question of coronavirus. How did it emerge? Is this an unusual event? And how could we, to Bhaskar's point, prevent that in the future or manage it in the present? So as you're all aware, Wuhan was the epicenter or the emergence of this novel coronavirus. Coronaviruses have been certainly known before, and you'll recognize, you saw on the map, SARS and MERS, both of which are coronaviruses. The COVID virus is novel. It had not jumped to humans before. And when we say jump, it means that that virus existed in an animal. That animal may have been the original home for the virus, or it may be a reservoir species from which it's transmitted out to humans. In any case, it is transmitted to humans very often because the interface between the humans and the animals is disturbed, or is an interface that is a high-risk interface. In the case of coronavirus, there's been a speculation as to whether pangolins, which is a little armadillo-like creature, or bats, were the original reservoir, and that the proximity of people to those animals and handling of tissues from those animals was the original beginning of the epidemic. What makes a pandemic, though, is the ease with which that virus then adapts to the human and is spread by the human. And so in this case, the respiratory, the aerosolized nature, the highly infectious nature of COVID-19 has really made that spread, as you've seen repeatedly. And I'm just going to very quickly show you one more screen, and that is to say, as you think about tracking what's going on with this virus, then many of you will have already discovered this this map that is from Johns Hopkins Universities, in which you see confirmed cases, deaths, total recovered, an important place for you to go for information as this disease spreads. So Bhaskar, I think I'll stop there. Does that get at the questions, or what else would you like me to include?
Great. I think this is a great foundation for us to build on, and we'll come back to you, Debbie. As you listen to both the origins and as we sort of think about the ongoing vectors of transmission of the disease, let me turn to Ian. Ian, could you help us sort of think about the role of multilateralism, international collaboration? Right now, we are looking at a reality where every nation has hunkered down. And of course, that is an absolute necessity. We do need to close borders, and travel is the major vector of transmission today. But we do need that global collaboration. We are also looking at best practices from one part of the world, and potentially not such good practices in other parts of the world, and then trying to figure out how can different countries learn from those experiences. Where do you see the role of international collaboration, Ian, in managing this disease?
Thank you, Bhaskar, and welcome to everybody who's joined us at this event. Well, let me just sort of start with the international law. There is obviously one important piece of international law here, the international health regulations. It's a binding treaty or treaty-like instrument. It's binding on 196 states in the world. And it's been mixed in its effectiveness. But there's a couple of really important things that are contained in that, which I think get at your question, Bhaskar, about the need for multilateral cooperation. One is that there's an obligation in those regulations for every state to have the capacity to detect and to respond to infectious diseases. And more specifically, if there's a public health event that risks becoming a public health emergency of international concern, something that's going to move across borders, it has an obligation to inform the World Health Organization about that and to work with the World Health Organization and collaborate with other states in trying to address it. So right there, you can see the importance of multilateral cooperation. If there was no sense of a responsibility or a need to inform international institutions or other states about the threat of infectious diseases, it's much more likely that they would spread undetected before it was possible to do anything about them. So that's one important element of multilateral cooperation that I want to emphasize. The other is, while it may be possible for wealthy states to prepare and respond relatively on their own to some kinds of infectious diseases, there are many countries in the world that simply don't have that capacity. And the need for multilateral cooperation and international institutions to help to build that capacity, to help to make the response more effective is critically important. So right now, the coronavirus has affected Europe, it's affected North America, and increasingly it's affecting countries across the global south, including some that are deep in conflict, and we may see those numbers start to rise in the near future. And it's inconceivable that those countries can handle this on their own. And so the importance of cooperation, both to make sure they're prepared when an emergency strikes and then to respond effectively, is critically important. So I'll leave it there for now, Bhaskar.
Thank you, Ian. And I think this observation, the last observation that you made, which is we have seen the impact of the virus largely in the developed countries, and then, you know, of course, China and Iran, in addition to that. But we are dreading the arrival of the pandemic in the global south, where the systems are so much more vulnerable, and the ability to control both the state of society and the healthcare systems are much weaker. We are currently at Fletcher, we're actually doing some research in trying to understand what is the underlying sentiment in on the ground in different parts of the world. We are scraping social media narratives, not just from places where the virus has hit already in Wuhan, but we are beginning to do similar work in New Delhi and Cape Town. And we're, just like Wuhan was the early stage of arrival of the virus, we studied the social media narratives that developed in January in Wuhan. We are now seeing that January period play out in places like New Delhi. So we're tracking the developments in the global south as we speak, for hopefully learning from what happened in Wuhan and elsewhere, and trying to adapt some of those practices that worked in other parts of the world. As we think about the opportunities for international collaboration, and of course the enormous pressures on political leaders to manage the public health crisis, and at the same time manage the economic crisis that is unfolding, let me ask Professor Dan Dresner about the political implications, and what are some of the political trade-offs that leaders around the world have to consider, and what would you recommend that they do?
Well, thank you, Bhaskar. And this is sort of an odd thing to analyze in terms of my own work, because I think I've written two books that would be applicable to this. One was called The System Worked, which was on the response to the 2008 financial crisis, which is an interesting comparison to seeing the response now. And then the other is a small textbook called Theories of International Politics and Zombies, which asks the very important question, what would theories of international relations predict would happen if the dead started rising from the grave in tried to feast upon the living. And most of the research, the original research that I did for that, was in response to pandemics and other kinds of emergencies. In terms of the sort of effect on the sort of political imperatives that actors have, I think in some ways the sort of gut level response that a lot might have is that this poses a serious threat to globalization, that this poses a serious threat to the sort of liberal international order, which was already besieged for the last 5 years or so, that generally promoted the idea that you want the open exchange of goods, services, people, and ideas. And others have suggested that this is the beginning of a power transition. That much like in 2008, even though the epicenter of the global financial crisis was the United States, it wound up being the case that US power was actually enhanced from the crisis rather than reduced, in no small part because financial networks post-2008 actually became more concentrated in the United States. Again, paradoxically, even though the epicenter of the crisis was in the United States. There are some that would say that you're seeing a similar dynamic play out now with respect to China, that even though the epicenter of the pandemic was Wuhan, obviously, the fact that China has ostensibly gone through the worst of this so far and is now doing things like offering aid to Southern European countries or offering aid to the African Union, the stark contrast between what is seen by some on the outside as a competent policy response in China contrasts with the United States, which I believe yesterday set the record for the number of infected COVID-19 folks. And the truth is that this remains a completely unclear thing. Trying to predict what's going to happen in the future based on what's happening now would be incorrect for a couple of reasons. The most important of which is we don't know yet whether or not, for example, China has truly passed the worst part of this infection, or whether you're going to see a secondary surge as you have the relaxation of social distancing and the relaxation of quarantine procedures. So that's problem one. And problem two is China is still going to have to answer for the fact that they were perhaps less than transparent completely in terms both of the outbreak initially of the disease. Although they did notify the WHO, they were reluctant to let either WHO or CDC officials investigate what was going on in Wuhan in particular. And the question is, frankly, whether we can trust the data. We know that, for example, Chinese economic growth figures have been overstated, I think upwards of 12% over the last 10 years. It is likely that they are potentially undercounting the number of infections and potentially the number of fatalities. Unfortunately, that would also be the case in the United States. The US is also behind the curve, very much so, both in terms of the data on number of infected, because the testing regimen has been so slow to gear up. Not to mention that there are reports that even in cases where people likely have it, hospitals have recorded the death as pneumonia rather than something else. So one of the problems we have going forward right now is that in contrast to the 2008 financial crisis, we're lacking good data on this. And so trying to figure out literally where we are right now, much less where we're going to be in the future, is difficult without more data transparency. But I would say in comparison to 2008, the truth is the system hasn't worked nearly as well for a variety of reasons. The first of all is that the sort of set of common interests which existed in 2008 to preserve an open global economy in some ways now militate more towards closure. Because obviously one of the largest disease vector for this disease is people moving across borders. And so you're seeing efforts to restrict them. And unfortunately, most of those efforts to restrict the movement of people are taking place unilaterally rather than with any sense of coordination, which paradoxically has made things worse. So think about, the scenes in US airports about 10 days ago sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So paradoxically, the announcement of the travel ban from Europe, for example, without any consultation with Europeans, essentially meant that you had massive rushes of people to get to airports, and then U.S. Border officials were completely unprepared for the surge of people that they wanted to test. So the result was that in places like O'Hare or Dulles or what have you, rather than presumably trying to test people to do contact tracing, what you instead wound up with was large numbers of people, some likely infected with the coronavirus, packed together in what could possibly be described as the opposite of social distancing. And so as a result, the lack of coordination actually probably led to a more rapid spread of the coronavirus, which is highly unfortunate. The other thing that's clearly changed is the distribution of power. It's a little more diffuse now. The US, as I said, exercised far more power in 2008 than is commonly appreciated. In the financial realm, that's still true. The United States Federal Reserve has actually acted relatively quickly, and that's been the one area in which you can argue there's been relatively tight international cooperation. But on the health side, and on the sort of political side, it's been nothing short of a disaster. Indeed, the United States has failed to get a G7 statement on this and a UN Security Council resolution on this because they've been insisting that the virus be called either the Wuhan virus or the Chinese coronavirus. Understandably, that has generated significant amounts of pushback. I think the biggest problem in some ways is that the difference between 2008 and now is the shift in ideas, which is in 2008, you still had a pretty strong consensus that, you know, a sort of open global economy, despite the shocks it might produce, was nonetheless the sort of best way of organizing the international order. It would be safe to say that there are leaders in charge now in key places that do not necessarily agree with that. And indeed, the nature of the virus itself, you know, leads to particularly populists to believe that the best way to cope with this is to erect ever higher walls. The only thing I would say in response to that is that in some ways, the one encouraging note is that the sort of strictures on globalization have primarily been limited to people, which, by the way, was never the most liberal regime anyway. So in some ways, it's been more restrictive. But what you haven't seen necessarily is a restriction on goods and services. That's still continued to flourish. And I'll close on that.
Okay, well, thank you, Dan. And that's a great place to close to open the discussion about goods and services, international trade. We are, you know, obviously looking at borders closing for people, economies not closing down, but economies going into a socially distant mode. But what about goods and services? Is there a future for international trade in potentially helping maintain some sense of order and continuity, and potentially even political leverage in order to get multilateralism back on its feet? So let me ask Professor Joel Trackman to help us unpack that.
Thank you, Bhaskar, and greetings to everyone. It's been very interesting to listen so far. One thing I'd like to begin with is really the question of the relationship between globalization and this pandemic. And it's obviously true that global movement of people has had some important relevance as a vector of transmission of the disease. And we'll have to, going forward, manage that as different countries like China succeed in managing the virus domestically and then want to avoid reinfection through travel. So as Dan was saying, travel is going to be increasingly something that has to be regulated. And as Dan also suggested, cooperative regulation, where we perhaps have certification of people, will be useful. In terms of trade in goods and services, you know, the 6 words I would say are supply chains, supply chains, supply chains. And, you know, we've come a long way in integrating manufacturing and production of services so that the reflexive closing off will be self-defeating, will be economically suicidal. And there is a relationship also between barriers to movement of people and barriers to movement of goods. Think about truck drivers in Europe. And so we'll have to look at that carefully. It's also true that there's a great deal of populist reaction to this crisis. And one populist reaction is to close down trade, and in this particular context, to close down exports of personal protection equipment, of ventilators, and now of food. And we've seen that in Europe. Interestingly, we haven't seen that in China. China apparently has not closed down, has not restricted exports of personal protective equipment, and other countries are trying to do that. And this is the kind of hoarding response that is a collective action problem and can cause the problem that it actually fears by creating artificial shortages. So we've seen restrictions on exports of those things. They may or may not be violations of international law. So under World Trade Organization law, there are severe restrictions on export controls, but some exceptions that might be applicable. So here I want to pursue something that Ian began discussing, and that is the role of law and institutions in this area. So globalization has taken place largely economically. Globalization has taken place largely economically, and we haven't had, in my judgment, sufficient coordinate globalization of regulation, both in the health area, but also in the financial regulation area, the cybersecurity area. And I think this is something that Fletcher addresses well, the overall context of globalization and the need to balance economic and financial globalization with global regulatory responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. And if I could just ask everyone to mute their mics, please. Thank you. That'll help us stay away from all the fun stuff that is going on behind the postage stamp images that we have on our screens. So Joel, you touched on some very important aspects of globalization and one of them caught my attention, which is the cyber element. And speaking of cyber, we are all now conducting our businesses on the cyber platforms. And while we have very few options, it seems like we are beginning to get quite comfortable with these screens, certainly at the Fletcher School, like all our academic colleagues around the Boston area and around the world. We are getting used to teaching classes and having seminars and symposia like these on the digital platforms. So let me turn to our colleague Josephine Wolf to help us think about how comfortable should we be getting moving our brick and mortar interactions to cyber and digital interactions. And where are the opportunities that might come out of this absolutely unprecedented, unique moment? Is this an inflection point, as they say? Hopefully, there are some positives that come out of it. And what are some of the issues that we should be worried about? And specifically, those worries, how do we manage those worries and those risks in a multilateral, international way?
Thank you so much, Bhaskar, and thanks to all my colleagues for their really insightful points, and to all of you. It's so exciting to see a lot of faces of people I don't live with right now. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and here in the virtual sense, which is where I am most places these days. I think if you're looking for people who feel there's a silver lining to this, the tech sector is not a bad place to be looking. And there are a couple different dimensions that works. And one is that researchers like myself who study the internet, who think about sort of how stable and how resilient this global network is, are seeing it stretched to a point where we've really never seen it in any sustained way before, in terms of how much traffic is being sent over it, in terms of the types of applications like this, synchronous video, which are typically some of the most bandwidth hungry. And on the whole, in large urban areas of the developed world, it's holding up much better than I think most of us predicted, certainly than I predicted, in terms of capacity, right? We know internet service providers typically operate at about 25 to 30% of their capacity. We didn't know how that was going to fare when we started seeing residential bandwidth networks scale up, that is the individual sort of smaller cables that run out to each individual house along your street, those seem to be doing better than we might have thought. And so I think in that sense, a lot of people in the tech sector are looking at this both as a sort of victory of the infrastructure that has been built out largely to support streaming video, right? If you were gonna point to anybody and say it's thanks to them that we're able to do this, it would probably be Netflix, which has so dramatically increased the quantity of traffic. It's about 1/3 of all of the internet traffic in the United States, that we actually have the capacity on our networks to do something like this. And on the whole, I would say my experience at least has been much better than I expected, shifting to applications like this just in terms of performance. There are also sort of technological opportunities that companies have been waiting a long time for, that they're starting to see fast-tracked. And the best example of that is probably Amazon and drone delivery. They've been waiting for years now for regulators to start thinking more seriously about what it would take to make that viable. And at a moment when people are really concerned about having delivery people out in the streets and going door to door, you're starting to see a lot more willingness to explore some of those options from a regulatory perspective. And then from an economic perspective, several of the big tech companies are doing very, very well right now. Amazon, perhaps the best example of that, both from the e-commerce side and also from the cloud computing side, right? Companies like Zoom, which we're using right now, we're talking about going to their own native cloud environments. And then when the traffic scales up to the extent it has now, there's really nowhere for any of these applications to go besides a company like Amazon Web Services to host all of this traffic. So I'd say those are some of the positives if you're thinking about this from the tech side. Some of the risks, some of the things that I worry about, first of all, are places where there's not very good residential infrastructure for the internet, where you don't have wired broadband, where you're relying on sort of very constrained or very unstable networks. And what that means if all of our education, all of our work opportunities are shifting online for people who are living, usually in the US, that's in more rural communities, but all over the world, it can look like very different things. There are big cities that do not have the capacity for people to be doing more than sort of some low bandwidth mobile broadband activity most of the time. There are some ways to try and scale that up very quickly with things like mobile hotspots, but none of those really expand bandwidth in the way you need, because in order to do that, you have to go out, you have to dig up the streets, you have to lay cable, and that's a slow and expensive undertaking. That's going to be a long-term project coming out of that. And the other thing I would flag, because most of my work is in cybersecurity, is we're also seeing a pretty significant influx in certain kinds of cybercrime tied to the coronavirus. That can be phishing campaigns that purport to come from organizations like the World Health Organization or the CDC and are distributing malware. That can be imitations of, say, that Johns Hopkins map that Debbie showed earlier. There are malware programs that tell you they're letting you download a map like that and instead are spreading malware onto your computer. And there's an enormous amount, we think, of industrial and economic espionage happening because so many companies are conducting all of their meetings through platforms like this, which are either not always well secured, or they are well secured, but the people using them are not familiar enough with them to take advantage of all of those security capabilities and are therefore leaking certain kinds of proprietary or sensitive information. So those are some of the risks that I worry about right now, and we're still in sort of the early days to see how all of that shakes up. I will say, I think within the internet community, there's been a tremendous sense of relief that the internet has held up even as well as it has so far. I think that's all for me, Bob.
Thank you, Josephine. We'll have an opportunity to come back to some of these. Okay, yeah. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, excellent. Thank you, Josephine. We'll have an opportunity to come back to some of these issues. I also recognize that we are working on a pretty tight time frame here. So let me go to Ken Pucker. Ken, you have lived through this, obviously not anything like this, but something that was perhaps a small way of preparing for a crisis like this inside an organization like Timberland. As Joel mentioned, the 6 words that are uppermost on his minds are supply chain, supply chain, supply chains. And I'm sure those 6 words resonated with you quite a bit, Ken, as you remember your time in Timberland and perhaps imagining what your colleagues there and in other companies that rely on supply chains that are global are going through. So what's what are some of the learnings from your previous experiences, and how do you use that as the breadcrumb trail to follow as we look out ahead? Ken, help shed some light on that.
Well, thanks, Bhaskar. I'm encouraged, as Josephine was, to see faces other than the same ones I've been looking at for days. I also am delighted to join a distinguished group of professors from Fletcher from different disciplines. Josephine's right. It's good to hear that there's some winners in this tragedy. I saw that Zoom's market cap is now 2.5 times what it was when it went public. So someone's doing well as a result of this. Most companies, I think, at least in the space that I come from, are really struggling right now. A number of lessons I can share from having to cope with crises over time during my tenure at Timberland. I did go through SARS. We also went through 9/11. There were smaller crises along the way, including the closure of the Port of Long Beach, which was the receipt point for most of our goods globally in Q3, when we ship and sell most of our goods in Q4. And so sadly, we had to go through a good number of these. I don't think any at this scale, however. I would tell you from a cultural standpoint, the companies that are best positioned to deal with these kind of crises are ones that have two traits, I think. One is that they have a leader who's been in place who's trusted, and the second is they have a culture that enables people speaking truth to power. The more you can get data out that's bad, early days, the better positioned you are to respond to it. And if you have a culture where people feel like they can speak truth to power, you find things out more quickly. I would say that from a process standpoint, 6 principles to think about when going through any kind of crisis are the following. The first is, whoever is running the enterprise has to be out front and has to take charge. A good example of this, I think, is the CEO of Marriott right now. If you've seen the video that he sent out to his colleagues around the world, well, at the same time going through his own personal crisis of pancreatic cancer, watch what he had to say, and I think it's a great illustration of leadership. The second is, I think that you have to position yourself to run to challenge, not away from challenge. It's hard. People tend to want good news, but in this circumstance, you have to run towards challenge, I think, to find out as much bad news as you can in order to be able to respond on behalf of the enterprise. The third point is, I think you have to acknowledge the issue publicly. People are concerned, and they're concerned by silence, and start to interpret things on their own absent an acknowledgement at the top of the scope of the challenge. The fourth point I'd say is that decisions have to be guided by the greater good. Invariably in these circumstances, you have to make hard choices between 2 or 3 bad options, not a good option and a bad option. But if you're guided by decisions that benefit the greater good, I think it's easier to make the hard choices. Fifth point is, try not to pattern map. These pattern mapping can be helpful in some circumstances. When you're dealing with a crisis and you pattern map, you probably end up with the wrong answer. The sixth point is, I think that you have to try to overcorrect. In these crises, we lack imagination for how bad it can be. And so overcorrecting at the outset, I think, will turn out to be an undercorrection ultimately. So I think you have to overcorrect from the outset. The last thing I wanted to cover is just from a business standpoint, not a process standpoint, what are the things to bear in mind? And there I would list the most important one is to prioritize between financial statements. Normally, executives have to balance between cash flow, balance sheet, and income statement. When it comes to a crisis like this, or most crises, you have to prioritize cash flow first, balance sheet second, income statement third. And you have to make it clear to the organization that that's how you're going to run things for the time being. So that's probably enough from me, Bhaskar. I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Ken, and thank you for the checklist for leadership, which will be the question that I would like to turn to and sort of put this back to all of you collectively. This is ultimately going to be a test of leadership, and the question is, where is that leadership going to come from? Is it going to come from an individual leader, Is it going to come from a collective of leaders? Now, we're already seeing vulnerabilities in individual leaders of different kinds, different leaders with different imperatives upon them. You had President Xi of China trying to manage the crisis in the early stages. You have Donald Trump trying to manage, or I would say mismanage, the crisis in the current stages. You have Boris Johnson, as today's front page news. He was late in managing the crisis, and now the crisis is upon him in an extremely personal way. So leadership may have to be back to that multilateral collective. And if we were to look ahead and try and make a recommendation for leadership, whom do we turn to? Which organization should we turn to? Which individuals or sectors or experts should be brought together on this platform of leadership, of course, in an appropriately socially distant way? Who would like to take that question? Where do we turn for leadership? Ian, go ahead.
Thanks, Bhaskar. I'll come at this in a slightly backhanded way because I want to also introduce another important area of law and policy, which is human rights. And I think it does illustrate that the leadership will have to be collective. What we're seeing in response to this problem varies across countries. But surprisingly, the powers that democratic states have are not all that different from the powers that authoritarian states have. The difference may be in how they exercise those powers, to the extent that they use them, and maybe the extent to which there are constitutional limits on exercising those powers. But in dealing with something like a public health emergency, there's a lot of balancing that needs to go on. And part of the balancing has to make sure that in addressing the problem of the health emergency, you don't end up severely impacting other important values, national values, international values, social values. And human rights is an area where typically you can't count on the government leaders, the leaders of countries, to be in the forefront of pushing for protecting human rights. It's something that requires a much more diffuse social and typically international response. So in that sense, it's an argument, not surprisingly coming from me, who worked at the UN and has studied international organization. It's an argument for institutional mechanisms at the international level, which don't depend on an individual leader, don't depend on a single person, but rather depend a little bit on processes and mechanisms and institutions and cultures and law, for that matter, to ensure that the leaders are guided to a certain extent in how they respond.
Okay, so Ian says, not a single individual, not a single leader, a collective, in addition to the human intervention, the processes need to be a part of this leadership platform, as it were. Let me go to Dan. Dan, your perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, a few thoughts on this. The first is that I think in a lot of instances, leadership is not necessarily going to come from the national or international level. It's going to come from the local level. You've sort of seen this already, at least in terms of public opinion polling in the United States, which shows that most Americans are placing the sort of highest degree of trust, or their greatest source of information is not coming necessarily from the federal government, but from governors and mayors. I suspect that's actually a tendency that you would see elsewhere also, because in some ways this is a unique crisis compared to even 2008 or 9/11 or what have you, in that this is a crisis that doesn't just have global effects, it also has effects on our day-to-day lives. You know, can we go out shopping? Can we do other things? And those are things that where you wind up very often paying attention to what local leaders are going to say, more so than leaders above that level. In terms of whether you're going to see leadership at the national or international level, I would argue that a critical tell is going to be whether or not those leaders admit they've made mistakes. Generally speaking, I suspect that those leaders who have acknowledged that they didn't handle the initial responses terribly well with that kind of candor might be able to build up more trust among populations. Because one of the problems with epidemics or pandemics like this is that almost by definition, bureaucracies and leaders respond usually with sort of standard operating procedures. Except since this is not a standard moment, they will inevitably fail. They will inevitably not work, respond in the most effective way. And indeed, we've seen that in the United States and in China. In the case of China, you had local Wuhan authorities which wouldn't listen to doctors saying there was a real problem. And you had those authorities reluctant to tell Beijing what was going on because of fear of repercussions. Some in the United States, even if you put Donald Trump to one side, neither the CDC nor the FDA handled the initial testing regimen very well. The FDA was far too stringent in terms of its regulatory criteria, in terms of permitting new tests, and we know that the CDC screwed up their initial rollout. It's only as a crisis emerges that bureaucracies start to move down the learning curve and leaders start to move down the learning curve, and then potentially know how, the best way to respond and to prepare. And the question is, at that pivotal moment, is it possible for leaders to maintain the trust of their citizens? Because that trust is going to be damaged due to the initial sort of first round of mistakes. And one of the ways that very often they can build that trust is by acknowledging, yes, we've made mistakes, but there might be ways that we can learn from that and go forward.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. And you mentioned that leadership has devolved from the national level, potentially even from the international level down to a local level. And one hyper-local level where leadership has gone is on the screens and the phones on which we are spending a lot of time. So I would like to also add to the source of leadership potentially coming from the leaders of the so-called digital nations. I do believe that the social media platforms are right now perhaps the most significant transmitter of news and false news about the COVID-19 spread. And there is leadership that needs to come from business and the technology sectors as well. We spent a lot of time potentially sidelining the importance of expertise and scientists, at least here in the United States, in the last several years. And now we're suddenly on a moment where the leader, at least for many people in the United States and possibly in other parts of the world, as they watch clips from the US, they turn to Dr. Fauci, whom Debbie mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. So let me go back to Debbie. Debbie, where is this leadership going to come from?
I think there's two important points that scientists inherently have become very global, have become a very global community. And so peer review and sharing of science is important. We exchange scientists across borders. Certainly right now with the current administration, that's become challenging in terms of the fear of espionage, government espionage around science. But fundamentally, people share science. And I think an example of that in COVID is as soon as the Chinese had sequenced the virus, they made that sequence available, which of course opened up the possibilities of people developing tests. So that's one level, at the very local level of scientists. I think the other is the importance of partnering public institutions like NIH with private business. So you've seen pharma, a number of companies, Regeneron, Gilead, step up in terms of either retrofitting antivirals that they had in the pipeline and or taking drugs that were not necessarily aimed in that direction and repurposing them. Of course, the yin and yang there is that corporations need to become more public-minded, and we've seen a lot of discussion of corporate citizenship and ESG and how can companies not only look after their shareholders but also their stakeholders and the employees in the community, balanced against some outrageous stories about pricing that some companies have resorted to for some of these higher tech pharmaceuticals that are very expensive to develop. So really two things. I think the community of science should lead, and as you said, Fauci is a great figurehead for that. And two, the folks that drive that industry should also be leading in terms of public-private partnerships.
Okay, great. So thank you, all of you, for sharing your perspectives in such an encapsulated form in this extremely limited window of time that we have to talk about an issue that would take us days to even get to the bottom of. Let me ask a final question, perhaps around this group, and in the remaining minutes, perhaps allow for a couple of questions from the wider audience here. So one question that has been on several of our minds and potentially touches many of the issues that each one of you raised And this is a question of how do we capture the vectors of transmission of this disease. Once we find out that somebody is infected, going through the process of contact tracing, and then being able to isolate people who have been in touch with somebody who has tested positive. Now, there are several countries that have used digital technology as a way to do contact tracing in a more accurate manner than asking people to just remember whom they have met in the last 2 weeks. And this touches on the role of technology. It touches on the role of the state and state overreach and potential surveillance of individuals. It touches on the role of human rights, and then being able to exchange this information across governments because you have people who have crossed international borders. Question to the group: should we be looking for location technology across the world? Currently, about 10 countries are using it to do contact tracing. Should we open this up and actually make this mandated across the world in order to do better contact tracing and try and manage the spread of the disease? Let me ask Josephine.
I'm not sure exactly what it would mean to mandate contact tracing at the international level. Certainly many more than 10 countries are currently doing or looking at some version of this right now. I would say the big split you've seen is between the countries that have sort of decided the government is going to run it. That would be China, that would be Korea, and the countries like the US, the UK that are really more interested in having some of the large companies that collect either cell phone location data or things like Google Maps location data to run those initiatives themselves. We've seen a lot of very different models for doing this, and I know we're running short on time, so I won't talk about all of them. I think some of the ones that we've seen work better in places like Singapore have involved anonymizing some of the data to the extent possible, alerting people you've been in close contact with an infected individual, you may be at a high risk, but not perhaps going into as much detail as we've seen in the South Korea alerts, which say things like an individual who's a 27-year-old male who works here and lives in this neighborhood was in this place with an infection, where we've actually seen a lot of de-anonymization of that information. There are other kinds of information as well that are being used. Russia famously is now using facial recognition to try and enforce quarantines for fear people are going to leave their phones at home so that they can't be tracked this way. So I would see you're certainly seeing an erosion of certain kinds of privacy around personal data, some for good reason, some perhaps for less good reason. And whatever we're doing, I hope we'll do sort of thoughtfully about what the long-term consequences will be at the end of this.
Yeah, I think, Josephine, the key word there that you mentioned is thoughtfully, because ultimately we are now curtailing civil liberties in a physical sense. And now the question is, how far do we go in curtailing civil liberties on in other environments, certainly the digital environment. We are about to hit the end of our allotted time.